highlight the fact that elections are not an end in themselves. Elections are part of what we call in political economy the bourgeois democracy state, which seeks to reinforce a democratic state based on separation of powers. Powers being, first and foremost, an accountable executive. I emphasize accountable executive. Secondly, and equally important, a vibrant legislature, which by its very nature is designed to control and ensure that the executive is accountable, apart from representing the population. It's answerable to the population, to the citizenry. And thirdly, equally important, a fiercely independent judiciary. Those are the three powers. You will agree with me that apart from a very brief period in post-independence, these three arms of the state have not operated as they should. Indeed, Zimbabwe, the new state of Zimbabwe, was born under very acrimonious circumstances. We came from Lancaster, some of us, which was signed on 22nd of December as Patriotic Front, only to arrive in Zimbabwe to find that the Patriotic Front was split. Someone, or some people somewhere, had decided that ZANU was going it alone. So from the very beginning, we had an acrimonious state set up, from which we have not recovered fully. In fact, we're in a deeper crisis than ever before. The second principle that we want to highlight here in raising the specter of elections is to ensure that elections in a democratic society should reflect the will of the people. We regrettably, and people like me and Professor Lodlo here have been fighting for years for what we call proportional representation. We believe in the nature of African society, proportional representation should be the best way forward, because you ensure that all sections of the community are represented somehow. And we do hope in the new dispensation, this is not the new dispensation, by the way, I'm talking about the new one, which must emerge after the election. We can revisit the Constitution and look at this aspect. So that's the context. And we'll be going around the country. From here, we'll be going to Mutare, Gweru, Mashingo, to try and sensitize our people towards a new era. We believe what has happened in our country provides an opportunity for a new beginning. Secondly, we'd like to look at the backdrop of the elections that we're going into. Firstly, it's been a history of nasty elections, right from 1980. 85, although constitutionally Zimbabwe was a multi-party, there was a tendency to institute a one-party state. So elections throughout post-independence have been marked by intolerance, by violence, and by disputation. It's a horrible history of elections. Elections in Zimbabwe have tended to be a war zone. And by 2008, 2013, people feared elections. The rural population in particular were reduced to mere items. Mobilization gave way to regimentation. People forced into line, stand behind the headman to vote for the party, the ruling party. So we've had a history of nasty elections. Secondly, these elections come about against a backdrop of a coup, which some of you call military assisted. Some call it a new dispensation. There's nothing else, there's nothing new at all. It was a curious kind of coup, an intra-party coup, in which one faction emerges on the back of military support. So we have a coup. We have a coup on the back of a very divided party and state. And as I said yesterday at the University of Zimbabwe, for me and for historians and political analysts, the coup represents an advanced stage of disintegration of the ZANU party and its state. Contrary to the coup leaders who said it's restoration, it's actually disintegration. So we have in front of us a very divided state, a broken state. As I said yesterday, the military versus CIO. You heard some CIO operators were killed. There's reports that many of them are in detention. You heard of the military against the police. I began seeing the police for the first time on the highway today. But still very feverish, not sure what they're supposed to do. But so too is the party, ZANU-PF. The Party of Liberation, so-called, is now a broken party. As I said yesterday, ZANU-PF lost the mass base in the 90s already. And what we've had, for those of us who have been observing elections, since 2000, the elections since 2000, the electoral process has been militarized. The Electoral Commission is run by the military and security. To this day, I heard this new lady, Chigumba, admitting that they are 15% of the staff are former military people at ZEC. And it's no secret that ZANU-PF has not won any election since 2000. It's not a secret that the elections have been rigged. We have institutionalized rigging in our elections. As I said yesterday, in 2013, it is inconceivable that Mugabe could have won 2.2 million votes. Impossible. I think they went overboard with the rigging there. So you have a party which is split. I was telling Professor Dlodlo just now that the reports are that of the sitting ZANU-PF MPs, at least 100 are NPF. And they're likely to declare themselves NPF on the eve of elections. You heard the war veterans complaining last Friday that many of those who won the primaries are actually, according to the war veterans, G40. And we heard one of the leaders of the veterans actually advising that don't vote for those candidates in the coming elections. Vote for those you know to be close to the community. So the disarray. So you have NPF, you have G40, whatever they are, And you have ZDF, Zimbabwe Defense Forces. And clearly, in my analysis and looking at the balance of forces, it is impossible for ZANU-PF as a party to win the election. Absolutely impossible. Doesn't add up. And so we have Shamisa, notwithstanding the complaints and the reported immaturity and so on and so forth, and it appears you'll win by default. There isn't much of a competition on the other side. It's impossible to imagine Emmerson Mnangagwa winning the election. Just impossible. And the question is whether the state is intact enough, the machinery is still intact enough to be able to carry out a rigging operation. The indication that they're too broken. And already, those who are outside, people like Jonathan Moy and others, are leaking the information. We already know that the plan to deploy soldiers in the communities was decided upon before the coup. And right now, in many areas, the population doesn't care anymore about the presence of soldiers. You saw, as you have seen in the northern provinces, for the first time, the opposition have been holding big rallies in areas where it was previously impossible to have rallies. Chiweshe, Chiwota, Murewa. These are places that the opposition could not dare. But we have had big rallies. First time. Now, one interpretation is that, well, it's because the state, ZANU-PF, want to ensure that elections are free and fair. I submit it's quite the opposite. They have lost control. They have lost control. They're so fractured, they're unable to put up a front like they did in previous elections. What does that mean, therefore? I mean, one scenario is that, of course, the ZANU-PF, or whatever is left of it, is going to lose the elections. The question is, what are they likely to do at these sections of the state as it begins to dawn upon them, as it is, that indeed the elections are going to be lost? Is it not possible for some sections of the state to become desperate? I'd hope not. I think the amount of pressure that civic society has put on the state in the manner that we are doing through such meetings, the extent to which the coup leaders have had to allow a high level of international scrutiny, including the inclusion of observers for the first time since 2002, means that inadvertently, they've allowed enormous pressure against rigging and towards ensuring a peaceful election. Secondly, I would also argue that it appears to me the combined pressure of the international community, national dynamics, the region, we've been speaking to the region, SADC, the AU, there appears to be pressure towards another GNU, but clearly a GNU in which, in my view, has a potential of being different from the last GNU. The last GNU, in my view, was geared in favor of those who had lost the election. So even though Mugabe lost the election, he emerges as the GNU strong. in control of the security apparatus. So we'd hope that in the this post-election period, we would have the opposition, who would have won the election, leading the pack in terms of how the GNU is molded. Certainly it must include a security sector reform of a serious kind, one in which the current leadership of the military, most of whom are beyond retirement age already, most of whom have already retired by virtue of going into the state, to see them go into retirement. I also think that we'll need to have the Peace and Reconciliation Commission move in and assist in a kind of an amnesty so that we don't have retribution. Many of those one of the reasons for the coup, if you remember, was in fact the fear of retribution on the part of those who have won the opposition. So it's something that we hope that those involved in NPRC and those like Sipho, I call him Sydney after his father, who has worked in these situations in the Timor, can bring to bear. There will be need for reconciliation to ensure that that we can safely ensure that the military, the security sector generally, goes back to the barracks, becomes as non-partisan as required by the Constitution, as non-partisan and professional as it was in 1980s. I was always on the Defense Forces Commission myself. The Army, you never heard Army generals speaking politics in the early 80s. It is possible to go back to that. So I'm hoping that through these discussions that we're having, and on the emphasis on the need for peaceful, free, fair, and credible elections, it must include, in my view, a discussion right now of the post-election period, including the feasibility or desirability of a government of national unity in which constitutionalism is restored, the Constitution, which has been breached several times, is restored, constitutional governance is restored, democratic rule is restored, and the separation of powers, which I spoke about earlier on, where we have an accountable executive, a vibrant legislature, and a fiercely independent judiciary is restored. I thank you.
There is a man called Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was a neo-Marxist. Dr. Mandaza, who's our political teacher and scientist, can elaborate on this man called Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci spent many years in jail. He was imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime. And from prison he wrote many essays. He had time to write. You know, when you are in jail, you have time for a lot of things, to think, to write. They gave him paper and they gave him a pen, and he wrote. He wrote some of the most fascinating things, including about power and governance, that inspire many of us up to today. One of the things that I found very interesting that he wrote, and I'll just read out the quote. And I find his words very descriptive of Zimbabwe now. So in 1926, Gramsci wrote The Crisis. He was talking about Italy in 1926. He said, the crisis is that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. This is so powerful. Because we have been accustomed to believing that for the new to be born, the old must die. The old must make way for the new. With due respect to Dr. Mandaza, to Justice Nare, we are not saying that the old cannot coexist with the new. But in reality, the old must give way to the new. It need not disappear. It must give way to the new to be born, so that the new can flourish. So, and I would like you to reflect a little bit on these words, and you might make of them whatever you want, from what Gramsci was saying. But anyway, I'm here to talk about elections. We've already heard that Zimbabwe has a history of violent elections. Zimbabwe has a history of elections that are neither free nor fair. Zimbabwe has a history of elections that result in disputed outcomes. This is a long history. Elections in Zimbabwe have been disputed since 1980. I do not know if people know that. Zimbabwe has never had an election, and I say this without fear of contradiction. Zimbabwe has never had an election ever since we got independence that was attested as free and fair. In 1980, the election was terribly violent. People don't talk about this anymore. People even forget that the British, they cast all their support from Mzorewa. We now think that the British supported Mugabe. They didn't. They actually wanted Mzorewa to win. They thought Mzorewa would win because Mzorewa presented the most moderate option that they believed they could manipulate. Of course, ZANU-PF started, violence in elections in 1980. We know that. 1985, this was right in the middle of the Kukuraundi. That election wasn't peaceful, especially in this part of the country. And as a result of the election, especially because of the overwhelming commitment of the people in Matabele and here to continue to vote for ZAPU, that the intensity of the Kukuraundi was actually increased. But 1985 was not a peaceful election. It's a fact. 1990 was not a peaceful election. That is the year Kombai got shot in Gweru when he challenged Mzenda. And Mzenda left a safe seat to go and harass Kombai in Gweru. Mzenda could have won his seat there where he was in Maswingo. But he knew that, let me go and teach Kombai a lesson. And as a result, Kombai was shot and left for dead. This is 1990. The only election that comes as closest as possible to having been somewhat peaceful is the election in 1995. And I say as close. But remember this. Once you have utilized violence, the specter of violence continues to loom large in the way you interact with those against whom you have used violence. Ungashaya umuntu uzahlale kwesaba. Akusho ukuthi kumele umshaye futhi. Angithi. It's not necessary. But once you exert a particular form of coercion, unless there's an assurance that that coercion or that form of violence is totally eliminated and it will never be utilized, it remains an important factor in the way you interact with a particular person against whom you have used it. So therein lies the problem. Is the absence of violence the presence of peace? Or is the presence of peace the presence of justice? So these are fundamental questions we have to ask. 2000, I'm going through the elections. 2000, we know what happened. This was after the referendum. And that election wasn't fair. That's the first election where the MDC won as many seats as they could. Of course, we can now go to 2008. And we all have vivid memories of 2008, at least those of us. I'm looking around the room. I think many people here were old enough to remember 2008. 2013 was the most peaceful election Zimbabwe has had. And there's a reason why it was peaceful. Because for a long, long time, African elections, in fact, for a long time, Africans didn't need to have elections. So many regimes post-independence were authoritarian. Not by design, but because the colonial regimes were authoritarian. So the inheriting of the state by the African leaders, they inherited an authoritarian state, a state which served minorities, which responded only to colonial capitals in the West. So Nyerere came in, he put in a one-party state. Nkrumah put in a one-party state. So did Moi. Kenyatta first, and then Moi. And all the post-colonial leaders. And then, of course, in many countries, like in West Africa, because people were unable to remove these leaders, the soldiers stepped in, especially in Nigeria. So successively, the soldiers, there was a rotation now, the soldiers were now running the show. So one soldier would give way to another soldier. After some time, another soldier removes him, and that is what happened. So in this part of the world, in Eastern and Southern Africa, meanwhile, the people who ruled were these liberation movements, the ones that liberated us from the colonial powers. And when they came into power, they established dominant liberation parties which controlled everything, including the electoral landscape. So when multi-party democracy was introduced, they knew that they must now have elections, but they also knew that they must now win those elections if they have them. And consistently, whether it is Frelimo, MPLA, Chama Pinduzi, ZANU-PF, Botswana Democratic Party, African National Congress, which is the newest kid on the block, which came in 1994. The fact that these liberation movements maintained total control and power of the state, it also meant that they enjoyed electoral dominance. They could never lose elections. And that is precisely why we have had ZANU-PF ruling Zimbabwe since 1980. That's why we have had Chama Pinduzi ruling Tanzania since 1960. I can't remember, I'm not old enough, I wasn't born then. Since Tanzania got its independence. That's why Frelimo has been in power in Mozambique since 1976. That is why SWAPO in Namibia has been in power since 1990. So the reality is that the system is rigged. The system is rigged in favor of these former liberation movements. We must accept that from the beginning. Because they are in control of the economy, they are in control of politics, and therefore they are in control of the electoral machinery as well. It's what it is. That is just what it is. I know I'm going to be told to stop very soon. How many minutes do I have? Then I can go quickly into the Zimbabwean elections. Mr. Facilitator, how many minutes do I have? Okay, great, thank you. So once we accept that ZANU-PF, when it came into power in 1980, it never ever intended to leave power. Dr. Mandaza at SAPES ran when Professor Moyo used to also be in the early years when he was a professor at the university. They wrote extensively about ZANU's attempt to create a one-party state. And they fought very ferociously to prevent the creation of a one-party state. But the one-party state was just part of the plan. ZANU never intended to lose power in 1980, and nor does it intend to lose power in 2018. Nothing has changed. with all due respect, you must admire these political parties, right? I mean, these are machines of an unbelievable note. If you can be in power since 1976, and you are able to navigate, you use different methodologies. Violence is one. And violence has been a very important and very effective instrument to win power. But at some point in time, the use of violence could no longer be tolerated. When African countries embraced multi-party democracy and required all countries, all political governments, all governments to gain political legitimacy through credible electoral processes, what liberation movements did, they did what they knew best. Remember that we have been told that this country was won by blood, and through blood it shall be defended, and only through the spilling of blood it shall be lost. This is not just words. Nderopa. Because the instrumentalization of violence as a political tool in politics, in post-liberation countries, is real. Why? Because our liberation movements resorted to violence because they were fighting violent colonial systems. And the violence actually worked. I've talked about this before in different fora. The instrumentalization of violence as a political instrument. Violence has actually worked. But in relation to elections, it backfired, especially in 2008. Because after the very sustained and serious violence of 2008, Mugabe emerged victorious. But Africa and the world said, no, man, you didn't win. This is not an electoral victory. Tsvangirai has withdrawn from the election. 300-400 people are dead. No, we don't agree. This election was not credible. That's why we had the GNU. The GNU was the compromise. And in 2013, the ruling party knew very, very well that they could not be violence. Violence would be very costly to the legitimacy of their electoral victory in 2013. And in 2013, not a single person, not even one report of violence in 2013, not one. But the election came and went, and people said, this is not free and fair. Well, not people, but the opposition. And Mugabe said, show me where. Show me how is it not free and fair. And nobody could prove it. Even up to today, I have yet to see comprehensive, conclusive evidence that this election, the election in 2013, was rigged in this particular way. The one in 2008, we know. Abantu bachayo. Bachayo. And of course, the intention being that if I'm beating you so you vote for me, or I'm beating you so you don't vote for X, or I'm beating you so you don't vote at all. Right. But in 2013, there are so many theories about how the election was rigged. But even after 2013, with the election having come and gone, did the legitimacy come? The international community still did not re-engage Zimbabwe. The economy did not recover. Because the crisis of legitimacy continued after 2013, because there was an overwhelming sense that the election had been fiddled with in some way, even though nobody could point directly to how. So now, 5 years later, 2018, what are the issues? There are 6 issues in my view. 6 critical issues that will determine whether or not the election in June or July is going to be free or fair. And fair, it's got to be end. The first one is that the voters' roll must have integrity. ZANU-PF introduced the biometric voter register, presumably as a response to the criticism in 2013 about the voters' roll. Because the voters' roll in 2013 was not released until 2 days before the election. So there was no opportunity to inspect it. There was no opportunity for the opposition and for the public to check the voters' roll and to check that it had integrity. To check that the voters' roll was a true reflection of the people who had registered to vote. Remember that the voters' roll is the most definitive instrument that decides who can cast their ballot. If the voters' roll itself has no integrity, there is no integrity in the ballot. So the question for me is this now: is there integrity of the current voters' roll? There's been a biometric voter registration process which is ostensibly aimed at generating some form of confidence and trust in the voters' roll. But the question then is this: has the biometric voter register been audited? Has it been authenticated? And I'm not talking about auditing or authenticating it through you going to check if your name is there, because you will go and check and your name will be there. But what other names are there? Whose names? Do we even know? Who is watching the people doing it? Who is auditing it? If, as we have been told, the civil registry is managed out of KG6, passports are printed in KG6, IDs are printed in KG6, everything is printed in KG6. So how do we know? Who can go into KG6? I certainly don't want to go there myself. But it is the responsibility of the people managing the election, not of the public, to assure itself that the voters' roll has integrity. It is the people who are managing the election that must convince the public that this register is a true and accurate reflection of the number of people who have actually come and stepped forward to vote in the election. It has no one else. No one has been removed and no one has been added. Number two, the ballot paper. My sister already spoke about the ballot paper. We've been reading in the news a lot about the ballot paper, and we're told, the ballot paper has been printed, is going to be printed, we don't know who's printing it. The ballot paper is one of the most contentious aspects of an election. Why? Because what you count are those papers. What you actually count are the papers. So whoever has control of those papers has control of the outcome of an election. So the printing and the management of the ballot papers must be very strictly monitored and must be managed with the highest levels of scruple. The number of papers printed must be known. The exact number must be known. Only the number agreed must be printed. Every ballot paper must be accounted for. That is why the election in Kenya was annulled. I do not know if people followed the story. Because when the judges asked the question, they said, okay, we understand that there are different ballot papers. There's a ballot paper for president, a ballot paper for governor, a ballot paper for MP, a ballot paper for councillor, and so on and so on. They asked one question to the lawyers of the government. They said, say somebody comes and votes only for the president and chooses not to vote for all the other candidates. What happens to those ballot papers? That is what the Chief Justice asked the lawyer for the government that had won that election. And he couldn't answer the question. In a normal situation, it must be possible, right, to say that Sipho went to the election. His ballot paper, he voted for president. He didn't vote for the others. Here are the papers. They have no one who voted. But the Electoral Commission of Kenya could not explain or account for those ballot papers that somebody didn't fill. Now, you can imagine what that means. It means that someone can take those ballot papers and vote for their MP and vote for their governor. So as a result of that, the Supreme Court felt, hang on a second, we can't say that this election has been free and fair. The third point, and I'll move very quickly, the integrity of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. And I have to say here, I think in all fairness, that there are many reports, and it will be important that these reports are verified, that the Electoral Commission is not independent. There are accusations and allegations. And allegations range from issues relating to the personnel in the Electoral Commission. There are allegations that some of the personnel are military or have military backgrounds, some are intelligence or have intelligence background. Of course, these allegations need to be verified. But more importantly, the Electoral Commission itself, because it is the one conducting the election, it must assure the public. It is not for the public to prove anything. It is for the Electoral Commission to assert and assure the public of its independence. Because we cannot, I'm a lawyer myself, we cannot impose a burden of proof on the public. Because remember that the assurance of a free and fair election must be secured and obtained by the people managing the election. It's for them to assure the public, not for the public to assure itself. So there are allegations around the personnel at Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. I can't say myself with certainty that these allegations are true, but it is important that these allegations are investigated and they are refuted unequivocally. And one way of doing that would be for ZEC to publish a list of all its staff. It's not a secret. Who is the Chief Electoral Officer? Who is the Chief Information Technology Officer at ZEC? Who is the Chief Officer for Public Relations? Publish the list. Let the public be assured that, oh yes, these are not in any way affiliated with any political party or any of the state security apparatus. That would go a long way in assuring the public. And really, I'm not suggesting that ZEC has these people there, but there are reports. And the reports have been going on since before 2013. Number 4, you cannot have an election unless you have a conducive environment for a free and fair election. What is a conducive environment? Now, I already talked a little bit about violence and how violence, works against creating an environment where people can come and vote. If there's violence, people do not vote because people do not want to be exposed to violence. So one of the things is that it's important that there are assurances provided that what has happened before with the involvement of security, with the involvement of militias, will not happen again. That creates an environment in which people can feel free to register to vote, to come out and vote. It also means that an election is a process where you choose your leaders. But for that to happen, your leaders need to be given an opportunity to come out and canvass for your support. They must be able to come out and share their views and their visions and their policies for how they are offering alternatives to running the country as opposed to whoever is running the country or whoever else is contesting against them. Now that requires that people should be able to move around, they should be able to share their views, they should be able to call meetings without any restriction, they should be able to share their views and their opinions, they should be able to criticize people in government and officials without any fear of being arrested, without any fear of being beaten by the police. People should be able to come together and call meetings without needing to get permission from the police. Right now, I don't know if you know this. Well, you should know it. You live, for the most part, you live in Zimbabwe. You cannot gather, 4 people cannot gather without the permission of the police. Are you aware? I do not know if this meeting is even legal. And this is really because we have a law in our books, the most horrible draconian law that requires people to seek permission to meet in a public space. I do not even think Smith's laws were that bad. 4 people. Of course, we are very glad and very happy that the application of this law has been relaxed in the past since the coup. By and large. By and large. I say by and large because there have been instances where after the coup, people who have sought to meet have been stopped by the police. And the reason is that the law is still there, so it can be used. What we need is for the law to be repealed, or for provisions in the law that restrict the ability of people to meet, to campaign, to assemble, to share their views and their opinions, to campaign in a free environment for an election. The law and the provisions of the law will have to be changed. The second is the law relating to access to information. Even up to now, you cannot insult the president. You cannot. Well, not insult. I mean, you cannot criticize, because a criticism can be interpreted as insult depending on how sensitive you are. So you cannot speak ill of the president. So, for example, Douglas Monzora said something to a picture of the president. He was walking past a picture and he said something. And he was prosecuted for almost 2 years, 3 years. That case went on and on. I think it was dropped recently. For saying something to a picture. I mean, because somebody heard him and they said, no, he has brought the name of the president into disrepute. I mean, honestly, a picture. And this goes totally against accountability. We have to be able to criticize our leaders without fear of being thrown in jail. Our leaders have to have thick skin. If they are tasked with running our countries, managing our money, they have to be open to criticism. They are not kings. Even kings could be criticized. So these laws that make it impossible for journalists to write about public corruption, that make it impossible for journalists to report about politicians abusing their power and authority, they make it difficult to have a free election. How do you expect an opposition candidate to come out and be critical about corruption and name people that are known for corruption if there is a law against defamation, there is a law against saying something bad about the president? You have seen in the US, in the UK, you say whatever you want. People said many things about Trump. He still won. He won. They said he was a womanizer, he was this, he was that, but he still won. So you can still win an election even if people say terrible things about you. So it's very important that the environment for the election, especially these laws, and this is for the government to do, because the government is the one that has the authority to push through the change of these laws. 2 last points. I've already talked about it, so I'm not going to mention the assurances that must be provided that the police and the military will not be involved in the election. Especially because our experience with the police and the military as Zimbabweans has not been good, especially in this part of the country. The experience with the military in this part of the country has not been good, I repeat. So any possibility or any prospect or even any suggestion or any threat or any possibility that the military might be involved in one way or another in an election instantly makes it impossible, I repeat, for our people to freely go out and participate in the vote. Now, who must give the assurance? The government must. There are reports we have seen. Are those reports true? We don't know. They may very well not be true. And I'm not even suggesting that those reports are true. But I'm suggesting that once the reports are made, they have a very detrimental impact on whether people participate freely. And the last point, which may not be such a huge point for people who have Facebook and multimedia and all these social media, but it's a huge point for our people in the rural areas. A lot of our people consume their news through radio, through television. Not everybody can afford the $30 or $20 for DSTV. In fact, the majority of our people, maybe 95, 99% can't afford it. So they are stuck with ZBC. They are stuck with ZBC. They are stuck with the radio, with all the news stations. Now, for a meaningful election, for a free and fair election, access to all those media channels has to be open to all the contestants in the election. That creates a fair contest. The contest cannot be fair unless everybody is given. Of course, people will argue, well, there's now Facebook, there's social media, there's now WhatsApp, there's now Twitter, but the levels of penetration, internet penetration in our country are very low. Not to mention that where do you get the money to buy the data? When Econet charges so exorbitantly, you turn on your phone, then the data is finished. So the fact that people have social media, they have smartphones, they have all this, doesn't cure the fundamental need to open up the national broadcasting channels and national newspapers for access to all the political contestants. I still remain hopeful for our country. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future, nor am I a magician. But I do hope that whatever happens, the election will be peaceful. I do hope that whatever happens, that whatever outcome of the election will be respected by the contestants of the election, if the election is free and fair.